Hi, guys. This is a brief screencast on the foundations of the French and Indian War. And we're going to talk a little bit about the causes for the French and Indian War. And alongside, hopefully, give you some background on French settlement as well, so that this all kind of connects. And realizing that the French and Indian War, in many ways, is a precursor to the American Revolution. So I want to talk with you first a little bit about French colonization. The bulk of this unit, when we have talked about colonization, we've talked about the role of the British and briefly kind of touched on the Spanish, but really the focus has been on the British and their level of colonization. But I think we need to talk a little bit about the French to make some sense of this. The French had been colonizing in North America starting in the late 1500s, and they colonized in parts of what today we know as Canada. We also know that they also did some colonization in places today like Louisiana. And sort of as a bit of background, the French had gone to war with Great Britain, 4 times between 1689 to 1763. So there was definitely a bit of a history of competitiveness between the French and the British. And the French Empire in North America was really based on fur trading in the north. And then they were also engaged with slavery and sugar plantations in the south. And much of their empire depended on Indian relations in the north and in the Ohio River Valley, because they were dependent upon the native populations or indigenous populations for access to fur and then for the trading forts that developed. But I do want to talk a little bit about, with that being said, what actually causes the French and the British to go to war. I probably should start by making sure you're clear. It's not the French and the Indians fighting against one another, but rather on the same side. So this war may have some struggles with its title. The purpose of the French and Indian War, I guess maybe from the perspective of the French and of the British, is really a defense of lands. Both the French and the British had colonized to a point in which their reaches of their settlements were touching each other, interacting with each other, and that was becoming problematic. The French felt that the British were had incursions upon their land, and likewise, the British felt that the French were coming into territory that they had claimed. So let's go through the causes. The first cause that we want to really talk a little bit about is the desire to be the dominant empire in North America. The British really saw themselves as being dominant in North America, and yet the French had started to grow in their power and superiority in that region. And so there was the sense that neither could really coexist together, and rather one had to defeat the other. And there's also that dominance that kind of emerges from the competitiveness, which had been going on in Europe for some time. For those of you in AP Euro, you had experience with the 7 Years' War. That's what this war is. It just spills over into the colonies. But ultimately, it's about competition and whose empire is going to be supreme. Well, I use that spillover, and there were several little interactions that emerged between the French and the British, particularly in that era of 1689 to 1763. By no means am I going to hold you responsible for the names of the war, but King William's War lasts from 1689 to 1697, and Queen Anne's War was from 1702 to 1713, and then King George's War is 1744 to 1748. So again, as we've talked a little bit about how tumultuous life in the colonies have been when issues are emerging in Europe, realize that amongst that tumult is this war, these little wars that keep breaking out, particularly amongst the border. I think lastly we want to talk about is the reactions. And I would say, I think by and large, the French and Indian War is really about how one side chooses to react to the other. So the French decide to fortify their settlements in the Ohio River Valley. And simply by fortifying your settlement, you're sending a message that you're preparing for war. And the Virginians, in fact, the British who were living in Virginia, start pushing their colony into the Ohio River Valley. And they claim land around what is called Fort Duquesne, which actually looks like Duquesne, but it is Duquesne. And Fort Duquesne today is Pittsburgh. And so there's fortifications along those regions, and then the British start incurring within that territory. So that's just a real brief examination of some fundamentals of the French and Indian War. When we come together on Wednesday, we'll talk a little bit about the war itself and the after effects, and that'll set us up nicely for our impending exam. Have a great night.